here. And yes, we are now about to move on to our next session, where Dr. Peter Kilroy will talk on discourse funding and dynamic research. And Chisom, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much. Also, thank you to Angela. I mean, I just have a million things to say, and so that will be the state of affairs for the rest of this event, is having to wait for another moment to catch you so I can ask follow-up questions. But for now, I'm so thrilled to introduce Dr. Peter Kilroy. Peter currently manages Wellcome's early career social science and bioethics research. Prior to that, he was an anthropology and cultural studies academic, specializing in colonial histories and legacies, and in post-colonial theory, with a particular focus on Australia. This work included co-founding a research, teaching, and exchange platform at King's College London for visiting Indigenous Australian researchers in the fields of law, education, and health. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to see the involvement of our funding body here as well.
Thank you, Chisom. Really appreciate the introduction. That's quite a hard act to follow, so I'll do my best to contribute to the discussion. But thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. Really chuffed to be asked. Beyond all of the complicated research funding processes that make up my day, seeing research like this push forward these discussions in ways that are simultaneously creative and critically rigorous is ultimately why I get up in the morning. So thank you for reminding me of what is important. I've been trying to attend as much of the event as I can over the last couple of days, and it has been a hugely energizing event. So thank you so much for that. So what I wanted to do was to pivot from a more traditional funder talk about what funding options are available to talking more flexibly about our understanding of health-related humanities and social science research, particularly insofar as it speaks to some of the broader themes and issues of this event. I will say a few words about what funding options are available in more pragmatic terms at the end, and I'm happy to try and go into more detail if anyone's interested in the Q&A. So I'll only be using up about half of my time for discussion, and the rest we can open it up for the Q&A. But the timing of this is actually very good, given that we have just launched 3 large new cross-disciplinary schemes, funding schemes at early, mid, and senior career levels. So I'll talk a bit more about that a bit later on. But what I wanted to talk more abstractly first about the question of remit. So how do we understand humanities and social science research? How might it relate creatively and critically to biomedical models of health, illness, disease, medicine, and well-being? And what might this mean for the wider politics of knowledge production, particularly insofar as that is shaped by colonial histories and legacies? I'd like to start with a few words about where I'm coming from intellectually, and Chisom has touched on some of this in the introduction. I actually mentioned I currently manage Wellcome's early career social science and bioethics research, but prior to that I was an anthropology and cultural studies academic, specializing in colonial histories and legacies, and in post-colonial and anti-colonial theory and practice, with a particular focus on Australia. And this led me to work with Indigenous Australian health researchers who were focused analytically on how ongoing colonial legacies impact on the politics of knowledge production, and strategically on how this affects models of resistance and the struggle of institutional change. So I think there's some really interesting parallels with the wider themes of this event that I will come back to in a moment. But as I mentioned, I want to start with thinking through some of the ways in which humanities and social science research might relate to biomedical models of health, illness, disease, medicine, and well-being, and what this might mean for the politics of knowledge production. And although this is something of a crude simplification, my starting point here is with 3 of the models through which we often see humanity and social science research linking to wider fields. And I tend to gloss these as parallel, convergent, and divergent models of research, with a cautionary question mark highlighting the fact that this is very much a simplification of a more complex process. So a parallel model might be two or more fields like psychiatry and the history of psychiatry, for example, working independently of one another and in parallel, but without really overlapping or without one challenging or engaging with the other. And this is closer to an older and now arguably outdated model of the medical humanities, but it is one that used to dominate historically, at least. A convergent model might be two or more fields like anthropology and infectious disease treatment, for example, directly collaborating to understand the social, political, or economic contexts of disease transmission, let's say. This is closer to an applied model of the social sciences that we do sometimes fund, but it's not the primary focus of our health-related humanities and social science research. But the divergent model is the one that I want to talk most about here. And this is humanities and social science research that does not take biomedical framings of health, illness, disease, medicine, and well-being to be the uncritical starting point. This is research that understands that framing is very often a site of epistemic power and violence. That humanities and social science scholars don't need to react after the fact to add context to biomedical understandings and concepts. That they can ask foundational questions that precede the division and hierarchical ordering of knowledge systems, or indeed the allocation of the status of knowledge in the first place. This is research that might want to start from a different place, like experience, breath, the voice, or indeed joy. This is research that understands health and well-being in the broadest sense. And may wish to decenter them, for example, as a window onto social, cultural, political, or economic worlds. This is research that may be as interested in challenging social inequalities as in producing better health outcomes. This is research that may wish to call research funders to account for actively participating in framing the African continent as a series of social, political, or economic problems to be fixed, either from the outside or from the inside, but using knowledge systems and institutions that erase other forms of knowledge. This is research that is attuned to the ethical and political complexities of accepting research. Excuse me. That is attuned to the ethical and political complexities of accepting funding from such organizations while simultaneously trying to challenge this narrative. This is research that is attuned to the explicit links between colonial histories and contemporary knowledge production and hierarchies. This is research that is attuned to the fact that such legacies don't sit discreetly within individual institutions or within firewalled identities, but are also embedded in complex global political economic structures. And this is research that understands that access and diversity initiatives won't undo the legacies of colonialism without changing those wider structures, and that no amount of institutional rebranding as decolonization will make that so. So all of which is a roundabout way of saying that we remain committed to serious, critical, and creative scholarship that doesn't set limits on where it may wish to apply its critical and creative gaze. And hopefully this resonates with some of the wider themes of this event, but it also resonates with some of the conversations I've had with Chisomo over the last year. But a lot of these questions come down to some quite simple points about knowledge production that, although obvious, are still important. They bear restating and they have significant implications. For example, who determines what counts as valid knowledge or knowledge at all? And where is this placed within the hierarchy? So in Australia, for example, Indigenous knowledge systems are increasingly being, quote unquote, recognized, and questioning the power, questioning who has the power to do the recognizing is obviously a key part of the discussion. But that recognition is almost always within a knowledge hierarchy, where Indigenous knowledge shifts from the status of being not knowledge to the status of being inferior knowledge. And I think that this also holds for the kinds of health-related humanities and social science research that start from a different place, like experience, breath, the voice, or joy. The challenge is to how to go from being positioned as valid but inferior knowledge to challenging the basis of that knowledge hierarchy in the first place, but crucially without giving into its logic. So for example, in making the case for the value of something like lived experience, health-related humanities and social science researchers are often tempted or forced to say that it's valuable because it is like the science or because it adds to the science, which for me just reinforces the knowledge hierarchy that humanities and social science scholars are then forced to climb rather than remove. So acknowledging power and the hierarchy in this way risks reinforcing it. And this question is obviously not just played out in the abstractions of geopolitics, but in the banal but no less political minutiae of global academic publishing, peer review, and academic funding. Research in and from the quote unquote global South may be increasingly common, and research equity or community engagement models are often proposed, but it's still far more common for that research to be in rather than from the global South. And for scholars from the global North to take the right to lead such projects for granted. And it's still far more common for scholars from the global South to be cited if they're based in institutions in the global North. It's far less common for such projects to be led by scholars from the global South, and it's far less likely for scholarship from the global South to be cited or indeed accepted unless playing into the intellectual conventions of European and American models. And again, I think that the same analogy holds, that implicitly at least, this knowledge is often deemed valid because it is like those models or because it adds to them. Like Reviewer 2 suggesting that your work on Igbo political thought reminds me of Foucault's work on governmentality. Why have you not cited him as well? So I don't claim to have any easy answers to any of these issues, and I claim no originality in restating them. And those of us in research funding in the global North are directly part of a structure that perpetuates them. We haven't done enough, we aren't doing enough, and I don't yet have many exemplars to point to at this point, even if things are thankfully finally starting to change. But to try and finish on a more upbeat note, my greatest hope here, and I do think that hope is a crucial part of joy, lies in working to change decision-making structures like panels and committees, for example, and working to fund researchers and organizations who continue to press on these cracks, to leave open space for work that is in equal parts creative and critically rigorous, and to continue to let these questions resonate, while at the same time not putting constant pressure on scholars from the global South alone to fix the structural problems that the rest of us have created and share a collective responsibility to address. So with that question of funding in mind, I just want to finish on a few brief words about our 3 new funding schemes at early, mid, and senior career levels. All the details are on wellcome.org/grant funding, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a moment. But to summarize, our 3 new schemes are the Early Career Awards for early career scholars, the Career Development Awards for mid-career scholars, and the Discovery Awards for senior career scholars. Each scheme is open to any discipline or combination of disciplines, and broad interdisciplinarity is very much welcome. And each scheme is open to candidates from the UK, Ireland, across Africa, across Central and South America, the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and across some parts of the Pacific, the Middle East and Asia. The Early Career Awards have a budget of up to £400,000 UK or equivalent over up to 5 years, but smaller projects are also possible if that's preferred. The Career Development and Discovery Awards don't have a specific budgetary cap and can be spread over up to 8 years. And I think that really excitingly, the Discovery Award scheme also has the option for wide international collaborations where they might be required or beneficial. So the schemes will be open 3 times a year. Applications are available now. The first deadlines are in October and November. And we're asking researchers for bold, creative, and high quality research that pushes at the limits of their fields and that transforms our understanding of what health-related humanities and social science research could be. So do please think about applying. We can only fund the researchers and organizations that participate. So on that note, thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to field any questions or comments that anyone has. And that is the link for our grant funding if anyone wants to chase up any of the further details. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to just have a quick look. Do we have any questions? This is a great opportunity, and we have 5 minutes left, so this would be the perfect time. Thank you very much for raising and bringing to the forefront those very central questions around the power, knowledge, and hierarchies. And it's something we've discussed briefly yesterday in terms of publications as well, the tensions between what is recognized in certain scholarly fields and which types of journals, and the obsession, which Angela rightly points out is an obsession of academia, of metrics, and how to resist otherwise. I see there's a question from Tandeka. Tandeka, would you like to ask?
Morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Peter, for that presentation, which is really invigorating. I just want to ask one question that pertains to access to funding and supporting early careers researchers, as you've said. I mean, I was listening very closely in terms of what kind of criterion that you find very interesting and fascinating for you to fund. But I just want to ask on a more supportive type of activities or funding that you could do, especially for early career researchers, because I mean, we know that accessing funding is really difficult, and you usually need an institutional setup for doing that, but that's not always the case. And also you find that you need senior scholars that have to partner with scholars that are younger and all these kind of things. So I just want to ask if there is an opportunity or something that you've thought about, or it's in the pipeline, that it's something that could be considered, like for supporting for personal development. Does that include in some of the categories of support that is available within Wellcome Trust? So like, for instance, I'm just thinking about issues whereby someone has like seed funding, someone wants to prove a concept, or someone has an idea that could be worked on. Because I think if we really want to put in the forefront and strengthen medical health humanities, there has to be that space for supporting early career in a more pragmatic perspective than just maybe getting proposals. There has to be a lot of foundational work that needs to be done. Is there space for such kind of things? And in a setup where institutions are not even strong, because we know that there are certain criteria that we need to meet before you can even apply for funding from Wellcome Trust. I think that's my main question. Thank you.
Yeah, this is something that's very much on our mind, because it's often one of the core differentiating factors between applications is which ones get institutional support and which ones don't. And it's often a crucial factor in making a competitive grant application. We have a new department that's being set up called the Research Environment Department that is explicitly going to be addressing these kinds of issues around research environment, research culture, which communities have been underserved by funders for precisely these kinds of institutional support reasons. And we will, so these are in the pipeline, but we will be developing projects and proposals and so on to work on that institutional deficit, which is one of the key areas. But it is very much on our mind and something we are looking to. I don't have anything to announce specifically as yet, but it's something we're working on.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's helpful.
Thank you for the question, Thandeka, and Peter for the reply. And it is something that we notice with increasing precarity in university context, especially for emerging career researchers. So that's very exciting news. Nirvana, your hand is up.
Morning, Peter, and thank you for this presentation. I mean, I found your ideas around divergent research, very interesting and very important, I think, in a country like South Africa, particularly where we really have to kind of blow open that space for change, but yet which is structurally and institutionally very difficult to do. So my question, I think, comes from, or maybe it's just a comment, from the space of mentors in this field and other academics and publications, and it's almost like an activist space, where we are right now. But you still have to have voice and integrity to kind of blow open that space. But at the same time, you have to climb that ladder. It's a complicated space. I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that, and even in the sense of publications and the kind of journals and dissemination of knowledge, which is still so privileged in a sense.
Yeah, I think what tends to happen is that things become compartmentalized. So we had a very interesting presentation yesterday on the BMJ Medical Humanities Journal, and it was very exciting to see the work they're doing. But it's a lot more challenging when it becomes a more interdisciplinary space. And I think that's when the knowledge hierarchies really kick in, where, as I mentioned, humanities and social science researchers often put on the back foot of having to create analogies to say, well, my research is important because it adds to the wider biomedical debates. And you're almost set up in a position where you can't take a step back and say, I'm asking foundational questions. I'm not responding to the framing that you have created. So I think that there are ways of dealing with this by having, specialist medical humanities and social science spaces for health. But that is one approach, and it does work, and it allows more nuanced debates to occur. But the challenge is, how do you get that thinking into wider discussions, into policy discussions, and into practice, where you're making changes and getting that kind of critical thinking embedded in the wider space. I don't have any easy answers to that, but it's certainly an ongoing conversation for us about how do we not just fund this kind of research, but how do we embed this in a way that's not just an instrumentalized version of applied research, but is much more about a foundational form of critical thinking. Very challenging to do, but it's a constant source of both frustration and inspiration for us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take one more question. We have reached the tea break time, but I think this is an important session. And so if there are any questions, now is your chance before we do allow Peter some freedom to go and have a break, and the rest of us to also take a break. Are there any additional questions? Okay. So I would just like to extend my thanks to everybody who's been involved in this morning's session. Catriona for leading us through the creative space and the workshop. Angelo for giving us food for thought and consideration, and I think different and nuanced perspectives on joy and being joyful. Peter for allowing us to think carefully also around what it is we want to do and how we want to do it, and providing us with information on what support is available and what might be there to take these new ideas forward. And to all of you for being part of this, for asking questions, and for, yes, providing more joy amidst the trials and tribulations that we face personally and politically. So thank you very much to our panelists, or to everybody who's participated, and to all the participants in the audience. We will be on a break until 11:15. Okay, so I'm only 2 minutes over that. And then we'll be into the second session, which is which will carry on. And we are on a different link for that. So you would need to, this link will close. So please make sure you've registered for that link and then click on, we'll open to that. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you very, very much. Much appreciated, and have joyful days.